In the frozen darkness of December 1944, somewhere in the shattered forests of Belgium, a 24-year-old American nurse named Ruth Brennan crawled on her stomach through the snow toward the sound of a dying man's screams, and she did not know if the voice belonged to an American or a German, and in that moment she did not care because Ruth Brennan had made a promise to herself when she enlisted in the Army Nurse Corps 2 years earlier that she would never let a wounded man die alone if she had the power to reach him. And tonight, with artillery thundering across the Ardennes and the Battle of the Bulge raging all around her, she was about to test that promise in ways she never could have imagined. Ruth had grown up on a dairy farm outside Madison, Wisconsin, the eldest of 6 children who learned early that life demanded hard work and harder choices, and when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, she was already working as a surgical nurse at a hospital in Milwaukee, dreaming of a bigger life, beyond the frozen fields of her childhood, and within 3 months, she had enlisted, and within a year she found herself stationed at a field hospital in England, preparing for the invasion that everyone knew was coming. And when D-Day finally arrived in June of 1944, Ruth was among the first nurses to cross the English Channel, treating wounded men on the beaches of Normandy while German shells still fell around them. But what happened next changed everything, because by December of 1944, Ruth's unit had pushed deep into Belgium following the Allied advance toward Germany when the Wehrmacht launched its desperate counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest, and suddenly American forces found themselves surrounded and overwhelmed as 200,000 German soldiers smashed through weakly defended lines in what would become the bloodiest battle American forces faced in the entire European theater. And Ruth's field hospital, just miles from the town of Bastogne, was directly in the path of the German assault. The evacuation order came on December 19th, but the roads were already cut and German forces were everywhere, and Ruth's commanding officer, a surgeon named Major William Crawford, made the impossible decision to stay with the wounded who could not be moved. And so while other units fled east, Ruth and 11 other nurses remained behind in a converted farmhouse filled with broken men, knowing that capture or death might come at any moment, yet none of them considered leaving because these were their patients. And abandoning them was simply not something Ruth Brennan knew how to do. And then something no one expected happened, because on the night of December 21st, a young private stumbled into their farmhouse, bleeding from a wound in his chest, gasping that there were more men trapped in a destroyed convoy 2 miles west, and that they would die before morning without medical help. And Ruth looked at Major Crawford, and Crawford looked at Ruth, and both of them knew that sending anyone into that darkness was almost certainly a death sentence. Yet Ruth was already reaching for her medical bag, already pulling on her coat, already making the decision that would define the rest of her life. She set out alone because she refused to let anyone else take the risk, moving through the snow-covered forest by the light of distant artillery flashes, navigating by compass, and by the screams that grew louder as she approached, and the cold was so intense that her fingers went numb within minutes, and the sounds of battle echoed from every direction, making it impossible to know where safety lay yet. Ruth kept moving forward, one step at a time, driven by something stronger than fear, something that felt almost like rage against the cruelty of war and the suffering it inflicted on boys who should have been home with their families. What she discovered next would shake even the hardened veterans who heard the story later, because the convoy had been ambushed and destroyed, and among the wreckage, Ruth found 7 American soldiers still alive, but too badly wounded to move, and she also found something else. She found a German medic, barely 19 years old, who had crawled from his own destroyed vehicle to help the American wounded, and who was now sitting in the snow, holding pressure on a sergeant's chest wound, even as his own leg bled freely from shrapnel. And when Ruth appeared out of the darkness, this German boy looked up at her with terrified eyes, expecting to be shot. Ruth did not hesitate. She treated the American wounded first, working by flashlight in the freezing darkness, using supplies from her bag and supplies the German medic offered from his own kit. And then she treated the German's leg as well, because he was wounded and she was a nurse. And in that moment, nationality meant nothing. And when she was finished, she looked at this enemy soldier and she said in broken German that she had learned from her grandmother that he could stay and help her or he could go, but either way she was getting these men back to safety, and the German, whose name was Wilhelm, chose to stay. Together, through the longest night of Ruth's life, they stabilized the wounded and constructed makeshift sleds from vehicle debris, and they began the impossible journey back toward the American lines, with Ruth pulling and Wilhelm pushing, and the wounded men drifting in and out of consciousness. And more than once, German patrols passed, close enough that Ruth could hear their voices, yet somehow they were never discovered. And as dawn broke, gray and cold, over the Ardennes, Ruth Brennan and her unlikely ally dragged 7 American soldiers into the farmhouse, where Major Crawford stood in the doorway staring at her as if she had returned from the dead. The story of what Ruth did that night spread through the ranks like wildfire, and by the time the siege of Bastogne was finally broken in late December, she had become a legend among the men of the 101st Airborne who heard that a nurse had walked through enemy lines to save their brothers, and Ruth never sought recognition for what she did. She simply continued her work, treating wounded men, American and German alike, until the war ended in May of 1945, and she could finally go home to Wisconsin, where the dairy farm and her family were waiting. But the story did not end there, because Ruth Brennan corresponded with Wilhelm for the rest of her life. And in 1962, she traveled to Germany to meet him again, and she found that he had become a doctor himself, inspired by that night in the snow when an enemy showed him mercy, and they remained friends until Ruth's death in 1998, and when she was buried with full military honors in Madison. The obituary described her simply as a nurse who never forgot that every wounded soldier was somebody's son, and that compassion has no uniform and no flag. Ruth Eleanor Brennan received the Silver Star for her actions. The December night, one of only a handful of nurses so honored during the Second World War, and when asked years later why she had done it, why she had risked everything for men, she did not know. She gave the same answer every time. She said, "I became a nurse because I believed that saving lives was sacred work, and that night in the autumn, I learned that belief is only real when it costs you something, and it cost me plenty, but I would do it again tomorrow because that is who I am and who I always wanted to be."